before I wrote the book, I had a series of experiences which showed me that the architect is not really at the center of what I call the building culture. The architect is part of a very large human system that includes not only the architect, but the client, the contractor, the banker, the insurance people, the people who deal with regulation, the people who sell materials, the people who decide what materials to be sold. It's a culture that includes 30, 40 different professions, all of whom have a stake, all of whom have a role in determining what actually gets built. But also looking at buildings being built and realizing that architects are to some extent constrained by this large system. And it had never really been written about as a coherent story. And that really is what was behind writing the book. And understanding it, not only in the present day, but over history, so that we could understand how it got to where it is today. All through these 20 years, I've been thinking about it and adding to my understanding of the building culture. So it's not so much a revisit as it is, as that revisit has actually been happening continuously over 20 years. And my experience as someone involved in making buildings, a professor of architecture, has convinced me that what I was saying in the book actually has some meat to it, and that and still needs to be explained. There are two big things. One is the place that the money for building comes from, right? That things have gotten much more globalized and much more dependent on a desire for investment rather than a desire to make a place that's suitable for people, right? So it's a lot of the building that takes place today is another means of investment, right? So that's one of the main differences. The other big difference is the challenge that's posed by issues of sustainability and saving the planet, or saving our life on the planet, which can only really come from building in a certain way, building a certain amount. And those kinds of issues, again, are not necessarily up to the architect. They really have to do with the building culture and how the building culture sits into the larger culture that ultimately controls what the building culture is. Well, in two ways, for the worse and for the better. Right? For the worse is that as I said, the investors have a much bigger say, I think, than they did 20 years ago, or at least what they do is more evident, even if they don't have a bigger say. I think to some extent rules have gotten, on the whole, more complex, more difficult to surmount when an architect or builder is trying to design a building, right? But from another point of view, I think there are signs of hope, right? And which I also talked about in the end of the book, right? In a chapter called "Cracks in the Concrete Pavement" or something like that, where local initiatives are springing up in various places as people realize that they need to take control for themselves of the places where they live. I think that zoning is changing in some places, and sometimes on an experimental basis, to allow more appropriate buildings to be built. There are contractors who will, at a small scale anyway, who are very willing to work with clients to make buildings that are, again, suitable for the client, right? So I think there are small signs of change and hopeful developments. Individuals have the ability to, if they're building a house for themselves, obviously they can hire who they want as an architect, as a builder, and so forth. But local communities, it starts to be a little bit of a political question, right? That the right people need to be elected, the right people need to be in place who are cognizant of the desire of this group of people to have control over their own place. So the immediate answer is vote, and vote for the right people who have the kind of control that's necessary in a community where there's a recognition that people in the community ought to have a big say in what that community is like from an architectural planning point of view. And I think there are several scales of intervention, right? One is the building itself, which through its size and the selection of materials can go a long way towards sustainable practice, right? I mean, at least in my country, the United States, dwellings are still too big, and dwellings are still largely made with materials that are not necessarily made from materials that are sustainably harvested, right? So that really does need to change. At a larger scale, it has to do with land use, very careful land use, which will allow buildings to be smaller, on smaller pieces of land, but also giving people the sense of generosity of space, because we want to try to reduce the amount of land that's used to make buildings, and if we do that, well, obviously more land can be left in a natural state, but it also reduces transportation costs, and transportation costs are directly proportional to the use of fossil fuels, and so the way we build, the plan of the city, the density, all contributes to this very, very vital indicator in sustainable, what I would call sustainable urbanism and architectural practice. I think one takeaway is that the architect is not God, that the architect is not solely responsible for the production of the built environment. I think the second takeaway is that the responsibility for the built world actually rests with all of us, and not one or two people or one or two professions. I think the third one, which maybe isn't as obvious, is that attention to the small scale is as important as attention to the large scale. The building detail, the places of light versus darkness, the shape of a street, the way that a person can walk down a street feeling safe, the way that a child can get to school without crossing too many streets where there are cars. All of these things are what make up daily life and are important to attend to. So this has a lot to do with not with so much the social structure of the building culture, but the kinds of issues that the building culture needs to accept as being important issues, right? So it's the role of the architect, the role of everyone, including all of the professions involved in making the city, but also how we see what's important in the city for ordinary daily life. Right, and I don't think those are two separate questions, because we need to get to the point where people want this to happen without seeing it as a compromise, by actually seeing it as something that they want because this is important and because they realize that it's not necessary to have a 3,000 square foot house to live in. It's not necessary to travel 45 minutes in each direction to go to work. In other words, the things that may now be considered compromises, we need to have some kind of campaign to make it clear that those are actually desirable attributes and that people's lives will be better and not worse if those things are included in our making of the environment, right? So I think the word compromise is a difficult one, because I don't think that's what we're after. We're after a whole change of mindset about what human life needs to be in order to continue to exist on the earth. So we did it.